Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. I'm Tony Lemieux, the founding co-director of the Atlanta Global Studies Center at Georgia State University, and I'd like to welcome you to the second part of our session on the future of global diplomacy around the world in the Biden era. So in this session, we're going to focus in and hear reactions to the session from this morning from our faculty and colleagues in the Georgia State University Global and Regional Centers. You know, I've had the privilege of working closely with each of the center directors and colleagues here over the last 5 years or so in various capacities. And so it is an honor to be able to be here, all get the gang back together again. And, you know, to really have some conversation that follows on, I think what was really an interesting discussion this morning. It brought up a lot of issues regarding what areas of U.S. Diplomacy and policy are more consistent, where there's sort of change and the sort of implications thereof. So before we really dig in, I just want to go over a couple of quick housekeeping things. First, the session's being recorded, so please keep mics muted when you're not speaking, just to reduce any background noise. We'll have an initial moderated discussion and then some ample time for Q&A. And what I really hope is this lends itself to a really rich discussion. If you want to ask a question for those in the audience, please do, or even panelists, you know, if there's something you want to note, please use the chat function, or we can use a raise hand function, and I'll try to make this as much of a discussion as possible. And so now to introduce our esteemed panelists. First is Lou Ruprecht. He's the inaugural William Suttles Chair of Religious Studies in the Department of Anthropology and the Director of the Center for Hellenic Studies at Georgia State University. His most recent books include Reach Without Grasping and Carson's Classical Desires. And he is now working on a book as part of the Body and Religion series at Rowman and Littlefield. So welcome, Lou. Ryan Carlin is Professor of Political Science and the Director of the Center for Human Rights and Democracy at Georgia State University. He's a collaborator with the Executive Approval Project and Team Populism, and the editor of Revista Latinoamérica de Opinión Pública. His recent research has been published in the British Journal of Political Science, Comparative Political Studies, and Journal of Politics, and in addition, Rutledge and University of Michigan presses. So welcome, Ryan. Dr. Alan Fromherz joins us today. He's the director of the Middle East Study Center and professor of history. He's the author or editor of multiple books on the region, including Qatar, A Modern History, The Near West, Ibn Khaldun, Life and Times, and the upcoming Global Gulf, A History. He's the president of the American Institute for Maghreb Studies. Welcome, Alan. Leslie Marsh is a professor of Spanish and Latin American culture in the Department of World Languages and serves as the current director of the Center for Latin American Latino Studies at Georgia State University. She specializes in Latin American film and media studies and focuses on Brazil and more broadly on questions of citizenship. She's the author of the books Brazilian Women's Filmmaking, From Dictatorship to Democracy, and Branding Brazil, Transforming Citizenship on Screen is her latest. In addition to other publications, she's co-edited with colleague Hong-Mei Lee, who had been at Georgia State with us before moving to Miami University, Middle Class and Emerging Societies, Consumers, Lifestyles, and Markets, and is currently working on a book entitled Black Cinema in Brazil, Rethinking Authorship and Agency. Welcome, Leslie. And let me also introduce Charles Hankla. He's Associate Professor of Political Science at Georgia State and Director of the Governance Programs at the Andrew Young School's International Center for Public Policy, and an affiliate of the Georgia State University Asian Studies Center, where he's here today on behalf of. Charles researches in the fields of comparative and international political economy, and he's an active consultant, having worked with the State Department, USAID, UN Development Program, and the G20 process. Charles is a regular commentator on politics of international economic affairs, and his online articles have attracted well over 500,000 reads. That's incredibly impressive. I think I'm still trying to get to like 60, and have been featured on the websites of major news outlets. Charles is a graduate of Emory and Georgetown University and the London School of Economics, and a proud Atlanta native. Very rare among us here, so that's another kudos. So what I'd like to start with, and I think we can, start the conversation just with a little bit of a discussion of and reaction to some of the themes that came up this morning. I know most of the panelists were able to be there and generated some thoughts and reactions. So I'd like to start, Leslie, with you, and just to sort of get your takeaways and kind of key points and highlights from this morning's panel. And I'd like to ask each of the panelists to take about 5 minutes or so to, kind of unpack a little bit of those reactions and takeaways.
Thanks, Tony. Thank you so much. And thanks to Diana for organizing us. I wanted to first bring up the issue of climate change and water security. I think that those were two points that were brought up during the discussion this morning. It struck me that the importance of thinking about climate change as an aspect of development and political stability. With regard to Brazil, I think that the country is known for its renewable energy sources, but something that we also need to keep in mind that wasn't mentioned earlier is the way climate change is impacting hydropower, for example, in Brazil. In recent years, because of droughts, the major cities in Brazil have had shortages of electricity and outages. So that's something to think about, and then its impact on political stability and economic development. Another point that I thought was missing from our discussion, and this dovetails with a point that Ryan brought up, and that's the issue of Atlanta's relationship to other locations in Brazil, specifically with regard to racial justice and social justice. I think we're living in a moment right now where there's a racial reckoning taking place in the United States, and a similar process has been taking place in Brazil for a few years, for a decade or so now. So those are just two immediate reflections. So I'll hand it off.
Great points. Lou, I'd like to get your take.
Yeah, sorry, I wrote mine down because if I talk extemporaneously, it'll go too long. I was really moved by this morning's panel and by the generosity of spirit, which all three diplomats demonstrated, sharing time and insights with us. And I really resonated with what was said concerning global climate change, the need for patience and the long view, as well as the urgent need to restore and defend civility in our institutions and international relations alike. The Greek consul's remarks sparked some further thoughts that I hope might have some resonance for us. The first concerns, because it's Greece, Homer's wine dark sea. I was struck that most of the issues that consul raised had a really strong maritime component. The ecological crisis prompted by climate change is arguably most visible at sea. We're witnessing rising ocean temperatures, rising sea levels, the collapse of coral and other ecosystems, the loss of biodiversity due to extinction events. And all of this has economic and social consequences. Rising sea levels result in the loss of property for sure, and possibly the loss of entire cities in the foreseeable future. But as the work of Orrin Pilkey, who's an emeritus professor of oceanography at Duke, has made really clear, rising sea levels may also result in the loss of beaches and coastline when developers and civil engineers attempt to keep the sea at bay. There's no erosion in nature, Pilkey says, only migrating beaches. Migration becomes erosion when you have $1 million home on the beach and you wish to keep it where it is. How we will deal with migrating beaches as sea levels rise more precipitously has an acute resonance in Greece, not only because of the country's tourist economy, which hinges on images of sun, sand, and sea, But Greece is also pretty unique in that it has protected coastlines as a public trust. What happens when such a public trust actually is on the move is no easy matter to anticipate and is going to be a global political challenge in our lifetime, I think. The loss of biodiversity is also due to global overfishing, of course. And another thing that came up was our witnessing repeated challenges to international laws of the sea, such that the territorial integrity of a nation's waters have been called into question, violated, and worse. The South China Sea, the Eastern Mediterranean, the Crimean coast of the Black Sea are three particular hotspots right now. Theodoros also noted the imminent political challenge that water scarcity will play along our rivers and other waterways. We need only look at the Suez Canal to see how interdependent we actually are on those kinds of networks. Marine life also doesn't follow or respect national boundaries that humans draw. Marine animals migrate, often covering enormous distances, moving in and out of national territorial waters. Overfishing in international waters has incredibly grave consequences for national fisheries in almost every country save Iceland. We're seeing increasing dependency on seafood through enormous industrial fisheries with attendant health risks, ecological risks to animals and humans alike. As the US plans to return to the moon and then to venture forth toward Mars, it's striking to me that we will have likely mapped out the moon's and Mars's surface more completely than our seafloors. The inner space of this blue planet deserves at least as much care and attention as our reddish neighbor. And I really love NASA, but I love NOAA too. The last issue I would raise, and this is just because we didn't have time to talk about it, the Olympics came up repeatedly. And really, from a comparative standpoint, all of the countries have hosted them. It's arguably one of the most successful international organizations and events in the world, certainly the most popular and well-audienced. And thinking through why internationalism has seemed to work there, where the stakes are low, but not that low, is probably worth further reflection. And it's going to be really interesting to see what happens in Tokyo if it happens in July. So I'll stop there.
Great, thanks, Lou. That covered a lot of ground and great points. So that we'll make sure to circle back on many of those. Let's go to Ryan next.
I knew you'd make me follow, Lou. It's just not fair. I'm going to just quickly summarize for those who weren't there this morning that the Consul General Carlos Abreu says there are 3 challenges Brazil is facing now that the U.S. diplomatic relationship with Brazil can matter a lot for. The first one is the pandemic, and the second is promoting economic growth and job creation, and the third is climate change. On the pandemic side, he sort of noted something that the U.S. has given some ventilators and helped to give some vaccines, but he's hoping, I thought it was interesting that he was waiting for the U.S. to kind of allow access to the surplus that we will eventually have, and probably not the too distant future. So I thought that was kind of worth putting out there as interesting from the first panel. On the economic front, he ties in new trade talks and stuff and treaties that may be in the works, but he also sort of makes a broader point, which is kind of related to the climate issue. When we think about Joe Biden's main issue with Brazil today, it's how can we stop, clear cutting the Amazon or burning it, and so the Consul General today says you have to somehow figure out a way to give the people that are doing this and who have incentives to do this to live. You have to figure out a way to kind of bring them along economically so that this isn't the alternative they face. And so I think those are 3 kind of interesting points that he makes. He also, I think, skips, so all of these, the question I posed was a little bit about how domestic politics makes the bilateral relationship more complicated. And I just want to provide just a couple of points on the domestic context in which Brazil and the US to some extent find themselves in. Currently, the United States has gone from a populist president to an establishment president, basically. Brazil is still very much living with a populist president who makes appeals to a very narrow base, increasingly narrow, it turns out. That is fueling, as it is, the United States may have lost populism, but we're still very polarized. Brazil is increasingly polarized politically and socioeconomically. So this is still there. And when you think about how you make foreign policy, well, the foreign policy maker's goal is to make things that will pass in negotiation, but also will pass in the public. You pass the public, get a public approval too in a democratic context. You don't want to be voted out of office for something you've done. So in a polarized context, I think that is something to take into consideration. In terms of COVID, truthfully, we have COVID denier in office right now, and the deaths are going to reach 400,000 in Brazil alone, with basically unabated. Maybe some of my experts will have some more information on that. There are vaccines; they're being rolled out fairly slowly, as far as I can tell, and basically trying to coincide with the election cycle to end right at the election cycle. He's hoping, the President Bolsonaro is hoping to kind of finish the vaccination right as elections are coming. And finally, all of this is happening within a massive political crisis in which democracy is at risk. Democracy was at risk, I think, the day that Bolsonaro was elected. Some prominent thinkers, Amy Erica Smith, a good friend of mine, a political scientist, has talked about how the pandemic has probably helped Brazil stay democratic because there's been so many other things going on that, Bolsonaro has been pulled in different directions, but he's churning through ministers, whether people are quitting or he's firing them. There are currently over 60 impeachment requests lodged in Congress. So this is bad times for this leader. The military is he packed his cabinet and parts of his big state positions with military leaders, former and sitting, and they've been in the process of distancing themselves from the president. They're worried that he may have proposed a sort of self-coup in which they would support him, in a takedown of democracy. And so for the first time in Brazilian history, all three heads of the armed forces have retired, have quit at once. Oh, I'm over my limit. Have quit at the same time. So this is a big crisis. Now the question is, who will Bolsonaro put into these positions, and will they be more friendly toward a self-coup or something like that? And finally, this is my last point, is that the elections just got interesting because former President Lula da Silva has been, he's out of jail, of course, but he's also now, his convictions that would have kept him from running for president have now been annulled. And so now it's really game on between Jair Bolsonaro and Lula, his nemesis. And so all of this is taking place in a very dramatic setting.
Great, thank you. And the sort of recap is helpful as well. Let's go to Alan next.
Hi, everyone. I really appreciated, like Lou was saying, the generosity of our guests and also everyone who organized the panel this morning. I just wanted to put up this map. I'm working on it. As you can see, I'm writing in names. And so this is going to be for my book coming up called The Global Gulf. And the reason why I'm showing this is, think for a moment what it would be like to be in a place where being global is not simply an option or something that is nice, but something that is a necessity for survival, right? And that is really where we are with the shores of this coastline here. Ever since, in fact, the beginnings of human history, the first written records of human history, people have depended on international trade between the Gulf and the ocean in order for urban settlements to survive in these extreme climatic conditions of the Gulf. And many of these cities that we hear about, like Dubai, Doha, now that really many people hadn't heard of before the 1990s, are highly dependent on maintaining international trade, on maintaining also a certain limit to increases in global temperature for life to be survivable in this part of the world. There have been recorded temperatures just in the past couple years above 140 degrees Fahrenheit in some of these cities, 140, 145 degrees. That is not sustainable, let alone for 50 seconds. You can't live in those temperatures. We are beginning to create parts of the world where it is literally uninhabitable for human existence. Ironically, however, this is also part of the world that has been a main source of the petroleum that is one of the main causes of greenhouse gases and greenhouse and the problems that we are facing with climate change. So what gives here, and what is the future of this region? And what does it mean for some of these questions that have been brought up? Well, there are some hopeful signs. The countries that we think of as highly oil dependent have begun to diversify. They've moved beyond simply dependency on oil prices, investing in other forms of infrastructure and focusing on green and renewables, also in desalination. But there is fundamentally this issue of you're creating artificial environments that are very difficult without air conditioning, without a continuous electrical supply. And they're existing really on the edge of many conflicts in the world right now. So what is the future of this region? I think if we begin to see instability in the Gulf again, I think it's a sign that things aren't working globally. And I think it's really interesting that Biden, the new administration is trying, as many administrations before have tried, to shift away from the Middle East, to go to the Pacific, to focus on China. They might be successful, but I don't think it's going to happen, right? Every time we try this, the Middle East comes back. And there's reasons for that. That's because this is always the center of globalization itself, right? But it lays bare many and most of the main problems that have faced globalization from the beginning. So that's kind of my spiel about the Gulf and the Middle East. And I think there's a lot to unpack and a lot to discuss here. And in addition, for example, with China, I think China could be, in fact, a positive player, or could help develop countries' capacities towards green energy, towards climate change, if we looked at this competition between the US and China differently, if we looked at it as an opportunity for China to do more than simply extract resources, but actually to contribute to, competitively with the United States, contribute to the sustainable development of other countries. So I think there could be some hope, maybe a new form of bipolarism in the future. Thank you.
Thanks, Alan. And Charles, what about your sense of the conversation about the kind of areas of concern or focus from a regional perspective?
Yeah. So thank you. First, I really want to thank the organizers of this. Diana, Tony, the Global Studies Center, and it's a real honor to participate and to be on this panel with all of you. So I want to, keeping in mind Alan's concerns and warnings, I want to try to turn our attention, at least for 5 minutes, to Asia and to in particular, 2 areas, major policy challenges for the United States in the region, trade policy and how to manage trade in that region and globally, and also, of course, the rise of China, which has gotten quite a lot of attention. and just kind of give you, at the risk of sounding like an idiot in a couple of years, give you my prognostications about where US foreign policy is going to go in the region. And this is actually kind of half prognostication and half kind of naive hope about where things should go in the region, and talk a little bit about, very briefly, what I think Biden will do that's different from Trump in Asia. So I think there are some clues to what Biden will do in this Carnegie Endowment report called Foreign Policy for the Middle Class. I don't know if any of you have read this or are familiar with this, but it was drafted before the election by Jake Sullivan, who has since become Biden's national security advisor. And elements of it have been incorporated into Biden's foreign policy grand strategy. And so what does this mean, a foreign policy for the middle class? The broad idea of it is to kind of move discussions of foreign policy away from debates between liberal internationalists and realists and isolationists, and in the case of Trump, populists, and try to refocus and recenter foreign policy on the question of what effect does American foreign policy, or what effect does any particular policy choice have on the middle class? Of course, that's kind of a political term, but what is the domestic impact of foreign policy, right? And to think about the broad domestic impact of foreign policy, not just on US corporations, not just on American credibility, international peace, but on the domestic audience, on the voter. That's kind of the idea. And the hope is that by doing that, it will build a broad coalition around US foreign policy, one that kind of prevents swings between internationalism and isolationism that we've seen in the past couple of decades, and one that might also forestall kind of destructive overcommitments, such as the war in Iraq. So what would this look like potentially in practice? It's pretty early to say, but I think that if this were to play out in the way that the Biden administration hopes, there are a few things that we might expect. The first is that we ought to see a more integrated and more multilateral approach to foreign policy. So part of the idea is that US foreign policy can be both pragmatic in the sense that the US is not overextending itself, not trying to police the world, not trying to be involved in everything, but at the same time can be very much present. And the way to kind of square that circle is through multilateralism. Basically, efforts to use multilateralism to offshore some of the effort that the US has put into kind of governing, quote unquote, the international system in the past, and to use multilateral organizations to do that. And to think more about the domestic implications of foreign policy, and also to think about all of the elements of foreign policy in a more integrated way. So thinking not separately about economic policy and trade, investment, climate policy, security policy, human rights, but rather to kind of understand that all of these things are deeply interconnected. Looking more specifically at trade, my expectation is that the administration will be more open to international cooperation on trade, which is kind of a low bar given how the Trump administration has been. But I don't think we're going to be returning to the Clinton administration anytime soon. I think with the rise of the political power of the Rust Belt, the effort to win back some of those working class Trump voters, and also the increasing power of the left wing of the Democratic Party, I think we're going to see any future trade agreements contain more labor and environmental protection provisions in order to kind of build support around those agreements among people on the left and also on the populist right inside the United States. So I think that there will be a greater focus on, bringing those sorts of protections into future trade agreements. I also think that the administration is going to, this is a little bit foreign policy, a little bit domestic policy. I think the administration is going to be focused a lot more on industrial policy. I see industrial policy kind of coming back. So the idea that the US government ought to use its resources to finance and support certain cutting edge, high value added industries, rather than just letting the market function. that it ought to use its power to encourage industries to stay in the United States, to promote labor participation, to promote the relocation of industry, discouraging outsourcing, all of these things. We're already seeing more of this in Biden's policy, and I expect more of it to come. And this will be complementary with a more kind of open and yet controlled understanding of trade. Finally, just to mention the rise of China. Obviously, this is kind of potentially the biggest foreign policy challenge that the United States is going to face in the next 4 years. As you all probably know, right now the prediction is that China will pass the United States in terms of total GDP in 7 years. And this will be the first time since the 1870s that the United States has not been the world's largest economy. So, you know, think about that for a moment. 150 years is the world's largest economy. According to current predictions, will be over in 7 years. This is obviously a pretty major foreign policy issue, in particular, given the fact that China has many different values, different political system, and so forth in the United States. So how to manage this? Some people have predicted that we're going to have a new Cold War. My view is that this is very different from the issue from the relationship with the Soviet Union, because we are so deeply interconnected with China. We need China economically. We need it in climate. We need a cooperative relationship with China. At the same time, you know, the United States has to figure out a way to deal with human rights abuses, trade practices it considers unfair, perceived aggression in the regions, in Taiwan and Ladakh on the border with India. And so this kind of need to do both things, to cooperate and confront, has produced a really schizophrenic foreign policy with China. And I think what the Biden administration is going to try to do is it's going to try to draw clearer lines and use carrots and sticks more effectively, and kind of integrate all of these policy areas, rather than pursuing a cooperative area on North Korea and a confrontational area on trade. The US is going to try to merge all of these things together. And I think it's going to try to do it through greater cooperation with with countries in Asia and other Pacific countries, in particular through the Quad, which was the actual first summit that the Biden administration held back in February with the leaders of Japan, Australia, and India. So overall, my expectation is the Biden administration's foreign policy will be more balanced, more centrist, and that it will be liberal internationalist to some extent, but will not revert to the old kind of post-war paradigm, that it will contain some of that Trumpian populism, particularly on trade. So that's kind of my prognostication.
Great, thank you, Charles. So what I'd like to do is sort of pulling some of these pieces together. One of the things that I think, you know, was a takeaway that I drew from this morning's session, and certainly in some of the comments, you know, now and your reactions as well, it really is sort of recognizing that there is a huge need for functional cooperation, and to really you know, recognize that the issues not only are sort of intertwined with each other, right? So when you think about climate and security and economies, but also the sort of entanglements, the global entanglements, where, you know, there's sort of multilateral. And one of the things we didn't quite get to this morning that I was really kind of hoping might come up a little more was not just sort of how the US and each of the, you know, sort of countries represented today interact, but more sort of thinking about the sort of web of interaction that is part of this sort of broader conversation. And so what I wanted to ask each of you to sort of think about, or to dig a little bit deeper in, are some of the issues or topics, you know, that relate to the focus of either your research, your regional center interest, or otherwise. Are some of those, I mean, we talked about climate as probably the most obvious and highest order one, where collaboration is absolutely central. But how do you see that unfolding. I think, again, moving from the Trump era, and you can take a longer view. I think one of the ways we just wanted to frame this was going from Trump to Biden is a fairly stark contrast, but you can also, of course, situate it in a broader history. But some of those areas of cooperation have proven to be more or effective in different regions, or more important in different regions, than others from time to time. And I'm trying to think about the best way to articulate where I'm going with this. But in terms of the transition between the Trump administration and the Biden administration, are there particular areas where the priorities or the cooperation really fell apart? Like, you notice in Ambassador Blai's comment, she talked about, one of the areas was on reproductive justice and women's health in a global frame. That was one where, like, the Canadian government and the Trump administration were just not on the same page. They see that as an area where they're kind of coming back. But I'd like to hear from each of you in terms of your perspective on the regional emphasis about, where that transition is going to be the most pronounced or most marked. Yeah, Ryan, go ahead.
This is a great question. And I guess one thing I noticed, and that the Consul General from Brazil today mentioned, was that historically the United States, at least in Latin America and other places, has made democracy promotion and human rights as part of their foreign policy. It has been, a lot of money is given to strengthen institutions and make sure that the United States and others are always dealing with democracies who tend to go to war less, tend to trade better, and tend to, I think, promote the same kind of values. So what I'm wondering is, during the Trump administration, those, probably that hit its apex at kind of Bush-Obama era. And then during Trump, you kind of backed away from this as a guiding lens. You saw more, you saw closer relationships form with autocrats all over the world. And so I kind of wonder if and how, from the Center for Human Rights and Democracy, if and how human rights and democracy are going to figure in to the United States' foreign policy, especially when they're trying to think about China on the other side, and China not putting those sorts of restrictions and leverage into deals. And I wonder if we see little, frictions pop up in proxy because of these major differences between these two world powers.
Great points. Yeah, Leslie, go ahead.
Just briefly, Alan, then I'll let you go. I would, it seems to me that during the Trump era, with the backing out of the Paris Agreement, that collaboration with Brazil with sustainable development and renewable energy fell apart. And I think that one manifestation of that is, in Brazil itself, is the massive deforestation that you see as a way for people to, lacking other avenues of economic development, cutting down trees and creating. I was surprised to hear the quote that Mr. Abreu this morning, Ambassador Abreu, mentioned that beef production has gone up in Brazil, but yet the territory for cattle grazing has gone down. And that contradicts some information that I have seen. But again, to reiterate, I think that collaboration with sustainable development between the United States and Brazil fell apart during the Trump administration. So I'm hopeful that that's an area that will become more developed in the near future under Biden. And last point is, we have a lot to learn from Brazil with their renewable energy programs.
Structure. I think I saw Alan about to jump in before. Let's go to Alan and then Charles.
Thank you, Tony. Yeah, I think fortunately or unfortunately, depends on your perspective, I think there's a fatigue when it comes to democracy promotion. I think that's particularly pronounced when it comes to the Middle East, on both the conservative and the liberal side of things. There really is no longer neoconservatism as we knew it in the past, which saw itself as a warrior for establishing democracy in the Middle East, right? That was one of the justifications for going into Iraq. We shouldn't forget that. And it's been shown with the results that we have, and also with what's happening right now in Afghanistan, where they're negotiating with the Taliban, who are the ones who brought us into Afghanistan to begin with issues of women's rights being put way down at the bottom of the list, issues of human rights taking a second place, as they often unfortunately do in the face of a new realpolitik. And this is neither, and really, as much as I'm not a fan of the Trump administration, it seems to be neither an issue of the Trump or the Biden administration as much as issues related to Middle Eastern challenges within those societies themselves. So I think it's a struggle, because I don't think that the story of democracy in the Middle East is over. And I think there's too hasty of a tendency to say, oh, the Arab Spring died, that we're now in the fall and winter, and that was just a false start. And nobody should have ever promoted it to begin with, because we're just in a worse place now. That's not necessarily the case. Tunisia was successful, and the reason why it was successful, one of the main reasons, is it has a strong middle class, a low Gini coefficient, so low inequality, and a neutral military that supported the people and not the dictator. That model can be transported to other parts of the Middle East, and should be. So it's, part of me wants to say, I think we need to be careful not to simply abandon our ideals because they don't work out the way we want them to. And that's I think has to be part of our relationship with the Middle East, and in fact with the rest of the world. So, yeah.
Let me go to Charles and then to Lou.
All right. Yeah, it's a really interesting question. With respect to the promotion of democracy and human rights, looking at the Asian region, I think, and I do think that the Biden administration will attempt to put a greater focus on this. Trump, was and is often considered to be quite aggressive towards China, but he was aggressive towards China in the trade arena. And he was quite unconcerned about, for example, China's treatment of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang province, quite unconcerned about China's behavior in Hong Kong. And so I think that the Biden administration is much more likely to be concerned about these human rights issues. And in addition, Trump and Modi, the Prime Minister of India, had quite a lot in common with their populism. Modi has increasingly been moving India in a more kind of, I guess one could say, Hindu nationalist direction. There have been some anti-democratic moves in India. In the Philippines, Duterte has, it's well known that he has death squads working for him. He's one of those examples of a popularly elected, genuinely democratic leader who at the same time is illiberal. And I think that the Biden administration will be more likely to address those issues, but they'll be limited to the extent that they can, because if the Biden administration wants to build a coalition of states that can challenge India's growth, they're going to need challenge China's growth in the region. They're going to need cooperation from India, from the Philippines, as well as from countries like Japan And so they're going to be engaged in that tug of war as to how much do we emphasize democracy and how much do we emphasize strategic issues.
Great points. Thanks, Charles. Lou, what about from your perspective?
First of all, just building on Charles's point, and actually thanks to everybody. Like, this is reminding me, Tony, that we should get together more often. It's so interesting to hear your reflections on your areas, and I'm really grateful for that. I guess picking up on Charles' point, it seems to me one of the things diplomats probably aren't in a position to say, but we're witnessing the rise of religious and ethnic nationalisms worldwide, and civic nationalism has not seemed up to the challenge of offering a compelling alternative. And that seems to, including right here at home, and that seems to be a really sort of destabilizing matter that we have neither sorted out for ourselves nor in the international arena. But I wanted to talk about a different aspect of nationalism that I think Greece is particularly interesting on. And I take the Greek consul's point that actually there are certain national bilateral relationships that are so relatively secure that changes in administration don't really matter, either in Greece or in the US, where they both ping pong between left and right pretty regularly. But when the Brexit vote happened, I was in Greece, and I had not heard about it yet, but some friends of mine were all high-fiving, and I went up to ask, what they were celebrating, and they said, finally, there's a crisis in the EU that's not our fault. And I think really the EU is such an interesting experiment in transnational collectives with a very sort of uncertain present and uncertain future. And the austerity measures that were imposed on Greece created incredible ethno-national, the neo-fascist party that mercifully only had a run of about a decade, but the way in which national rivalries have reasserted themselves within the EU, precisely when it was originally supposed to be an economic union, but their economic interests don't even align. Since so much of what we're talking about is international arrangements, I guess Greece is a really telling place to see how fragile they always are in the best of circumstances. And that resurgent nationalisms are really troubling international relations in a lot of ways that have made even coherent confrontation with a problem as obvious as climate change difficult to manage. So many of you shared some somber stories. My somber Greek lesson is that Greece was at the epicenter, highlighting a real problem within the quasi-union that is Europe. And Europe is so, happy to welcome Biden, but Biden can't do anything about that as near as I can tell. So
some great points. And I'd like to stick with that. One of the things that we were just sort of brushing up against in the session this morning, but really didn't hit it quite as head on or in as much details. And Ryan, I really appreciate the question that you kind of got us a little closer to it, but thinking about the levels of internal polarization that appeal to nationalist and populist rhetoric and the implications there. Because I think this is one where, we've sort of stressed the importance of international cooperation on a number of key issues. Then when you kind of juxtapose that with this really sort of push towards, more strong nationalist stances or things that, border on, rhetoric might not have been all the way isolationist, but, was moving in that direction, for some time. So I guess the question here is, how much has that been in play? We know certainly in India, we know certainly in Brazil, we know, that in terms of, you know, the US that we've sort of been in that space, and we still are, even though the political power balance has shifted. It doesn't mean the sort of polarization or that populism has subsided, you know, drastically. But within the EU, for instance, I mean, this is true in Hungary. This is true. I mean, this sort of nationalism and populism is a broader phenomena, and yet, you know, the extent to which that will impact, you know, the kind of cooperation that's possible. I'd love for us to lean a little deeper into that particular challenge. I think that's one, again, the subtext, you know, of the session this morning was, yes, international cooperation is necessary. We're doing really well on all these fronts, and here's the, you know, the receipts for that. And at the same time, we say, well, there's also this sort of other thing happening in the nationalism and populism space that might give us some pause. So I'd love to just invite some conversation on that, and we, you know, we can start to shift into. I'd love for, if those in the audience at this point start to have questions, you can, you know, start to put them in the chat, please. But I'd love to hear you, you know, riff on this, and you can, you know, jump in and out of the conversation. I mean, we're all watching each other, so you can see who wants to talk. So I don't feel like I have to call on people as much as just like, let's get into it.
I mean, one of the patterns that I think we see globally, like a global pattern of autocracy, is, I mean, taken right out of the Bolshevik playbook, like delegitimize parliaments, the press, politicize the judiciary, and basically say, give the power to me and I'll sort it out. And I mean, we're witnessing that strategy in a pretty transparent way in all the hotspots we're talking about. And it's puzzling how, I mean, it makes me apoplectic, which means I have no idea how to deal with this other than to sort of bluster and say how wrong and anti-democratic it is. But I really feel like we're, in terms of globalization, that's a global trend, and it's really worrisome. In terms, sort of, Ryan, to your question that prompted this whole thing, that, you know, democracy is more than a system. It's a set of commitments, and those commitments are fragile too. I guess that's the thing I feel most bleak about right now.
I think Alan, I think, wanted to say something, and
oh, sure. I just wanted to say, I think one of the major lessons of the past even 8 years is that the American public it can't be taken for granted as part of this process of the global community. And I think what Charles was saying about Dr. Sullivan, I think, or Mr. Sullivan's paper, really we need to come back to that. Because I think what's happening now with a lot of, even with this project towards cutting global emissions, as much as we might support it, and I definitely support Biden's pledge and Europe's pledge, if we don't see China and India themselves standing up, and Brazil as well, and taking real leadership in making similar pledges, what's that going to do domestically in terms of making Biden vulnerable in the next election? I think it's going to make him extremely vulnerable, because people are going to say, wait, why are we having to make all these sacrifices when they're just going to go and eat it all up and and take our jobs? You know, it's a very easy argument on the right to make. So the only way that Biden can be given latitude is for these countries that are rising in prominence to actually take global leadership, right? And part of that global leadership is to make global commitments that are real, right? And I know the U.S. historically has a commitment as well because of its, I mean, in Europe as well, the history of the Industrial Revolution and so on. But I think there needs to be some way of working together beyond the elite Davos set, because once it becomes that, then you have populism come into play. And once Europe and the United States are out of the picture because of populism, nothing will move forward. So it's really, you know, there has to be leadership on these emerging powers, or I don't think there's very much hope.
Yeah, I think, you know, this is, as Lou said earlier, I think this wave, if you will, of illiberal democracy or electoral authoritarianism, as the term goes, that we've seen in the last few years is one of the most disturbing and also interesting phenomena, you know, of the last couple of decades. And it definitely makes me think of Huntington's work and how he showed that democracy and autocracy moves in waves. And, you know, it helps us as Americans. You know, we tend to see our country as kind of sui generis and you know, the Trump phenomenon is an American thing and so forth. And of course it is, but it helps us understand that we are also subject to these types of global trends that we're seeing, not just in the United States, but in Brazil and in India and in Mexico and in the Philippines and, you know, in Hungary and all over the world. And so, you know, why is this happening? As a political economist, I think there is a big economic driver, the 2008 global recession. I don't think this would have happened without that, just as fascism wouldn't have become so prominent without the Great Depression. And I think also that the transformations in the world economy, where you have, you know, increasing globalization and increasing reliance on skills in the United States and in the developed world, have meant that a lot of lower skilled, less educated people are unable to find stable work. And this has produced a lot of resentment. There's obviously also social issues, like in Europe in particular, the refugee crisis has created questions about what it means to be, you know, French or German or what have you. And likewise in the United States, you know, the increasing internationalization of the country has produced questions like that on the right. But, you know, all of these trends are happening globally. How do we deal with it? I mean, I think what's interesting is that we're not seeing a shift back to full-on autocracy so much as we're seeing an erosion of democratic values and institutions. Whereas we're still having elections, we're having, you know, it's more of a slow erosion, and that concerns me because it's hard to get those sorts of norms and institutions back once you've lost them. My view is, you know, the old-fashioned welfare state is one way of reconciling people to these changes. And I think that that's what Biden is trying to do with some of these payments. And I personally think that's, you know, that's the solution to calming things down in the US, is to give people more economic opportunity. And I think that'll lower the temperature. But in terms of foreign policy, I think mostly this is something countries are going to have to deal with domestically. So,
I guess I agree with everything my colleagues have said, and really like this this discussion. The thing that prompted my thinking on this question was, so let's take where Alan and Charles and Lou have kind of left us off at the domestic level, and now say, okay, let's imagine a hugely complex problem that's global, which is climate change, and how do these actors who have to cooperate at the international level, how can they do that when at home they're becoming the embodiment of a nation, as Lou talks about nationalism? Nationalism, you know, you're not going to sell out, right? You're not going to take, so apparently Joe Biden is trying to offer Brazil $1 billion a year to protect the Amazon, so they reduce cutting by 30% a year in the Amazon. So I mean, and so establishment leaders, in other words, non-populist leaders, they have a little more leeway. They're a little bit more milquetoast. You can't pin them to the wall, you know, and they can cut deals a little bit easier, I think. And so when the world was dominated by establishment people, I think the cooperation, the prospects for cooperation for on the big problems like this were better. Now that we've seen a shift where more nationalist and populist leaders and some authoritarian as well, but they have they're less constrained by their own publics. And those who do rely on their own publics are often making a very nationalistic stance, which makes it, maybe it hems them in terms of coming up with solutions that would fit in a negotiation that's very complex.
So all really great points. Leslie, do you have anything you'd want to add to that? So, okay, let me, you know, focus in on that, because one of the things in some of the comments, it reminded me, so earlier in the week, we had a keynote from Elizabeth Cohen, who's a political scientist who has a great book on immigration. It's called Illegal, and she really talked through some of that. And one of the things that I think is important, you know, and I'll bring it back to this conversation here, but, you know, she was talking about sort of flows of population and the perception versus reality in terms of, you know, the levels of migration, where migration's coming from. And so one of the things that I kind of took from that is when you're in that space of that really kind of, you know, that the populist rhetoric is sort of at fever pitch, the data and the facts just cease to matter as much, right? The fact that, you know, that immigration is net down, and in fact, you need that as, you know, in terms of population replacement, otherwise your economy is going to shrink, right? It's not that we're fighting for jobs, but, you know, so one of the things I think is a huge challenge in all this, and I wanted to ask you about, is like what the sort of different variations of on this theme about, you know, what data and what kind of facts are cutting through that noise, and how, to what extent is there a, you know, regional or national differences in that that might play into some of our conversation, because it does speak to some of the issues about, well, why would we be concerned about what's going on over there, or why would we, you know, sacrifice some of that national, you know, autonomy and, you know, subject ourselves to some other rules if they're not going to play by it, you know. So I was thinking about sort of the interrelation of that, but the thing I kept coming back to is that there's just these sort of different, I guess, to quote a horrible term, alternate facts, you know, and what people sort of hone in on. And I think part of the basis of cooperation would be at least having some semblance of that we're talking about the same thing, the same data, the same facts, the same phenomena. So I just wanted to see if there was, if there was anything that you could, you know, bring in from that perspective as to how that's playing out. Let me go to Lou and then Alan.
I'd rather hear from Alan first.
Okay, then
I
we'll
won't
go to
forget
Alan
what
and
I'm
then
going
Lou.
to say.
Oh, thank you. I always like hearing from you first, Lou. So I just posted an article from Newsweek on the chat, and I find it really interesting because it kind of overturns assumptions, even though I know there's a lot of predicting about the China surpassing the United States. But this article makes a really good point that because of demographics in the United States, and specifically because we've remained open relatively to immigration, it may be that the United States won't be surpassed by China. And I think that's a really important point, because I think one way to get around some of these issues is to say, hey, so you want the United States to remain on top and to be a great country and to prevail over China. Well, one of the ways of doing that is actually to open us up to more legal immigration, right? To welcome more people who are highly specialized and can start companies from around the world, to welcome refugees who have a track record of working very hard and contributing to the economy. That I think sometimes we take issues and we put them into silos, and within those silos, people divide into their political positions. But I think if we take issues and we put them together, we can see that the politics can actually be mixed, and that you could maybe even get an avowed nationalist who wants to defeat China convinced or that wants to keep America on top. Well, we need to fix our immigration system and allow for more immigration so that demographically we can remain on top for people who are interested in that. So I think thinking strategically about our own population in the United States and its politics and its relationship to the global picture is crucial, even if not everyone in the United States has their radar on the global picture, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it's a point well taken.
That's why I wanted to hear you go first, Alan. I love that as a strategy. I guess that I wanted to say two things about it. The first is, again, related to the EU. I mean, I'm really haunted by the depth and breadth of political refugees and soon ecological refugees. I mean, we're witnessing this kind of global migration deepening in profundity. And I mean, it's what to do with refugees is one of the most sort of difficult questions for the EU, right? People can get into Greece and Italy, but they don't want to stay there. Their target is Europe, and then the EU tells them they gotta stay in Italy and Greece, and those two poor countries in economic crisis have to figure out how to pay for it, and which has now created a human rights disaster. So the refugee crisis in Greece has really highlighted once again the really riven nationalisms that are within the union. The other thing I wanted to, and I'd really be curious for Leslie and Ryan primarily, I think the Consul General made an observation that it really kind of made me sit up, and I felt good about it. He said, I think he said something to the effect that we're living in the least violent hemisphere. And it got me thinking about, what's your metric of violence? Like, there's a global question, is what our metrics of violence are as we make these diplomatic assessments about so-called hotspots. That really jumped out at me, and I was really curious if other people had thoughts about that.
That stood out to me as well. He said that Latin America is the most, I wrote it down, Latin America is the most peaceful region in the world. My understanding is that he was thinking about warfare and invasions of neighbors. So I don't know that in an absolute sense that you can say that Latin America is the most peaceful, neither from a current nor historic perspective. So, and also, as we know, there are different manifestations of violence. So, anyway, Ryan, do you want to take over?
Luckily, I was muted. I didn't interrupt you. No, that the region itself, I mean, so some of the countries with the highest murder rates are Honduras and Guatemala and El Salvador and the Northern Triangle countries. And certainly Colombia is living through an odd time in which their main insurgent group is falling back, and it's being filled by criminal gangs doing even worse stuff. So in terms of war, definitely, but in terms of criminal organizations, which is another big global problem, you know, certainly I'd say Latin America, including Brazilians' favelas, can be extremely dangerous and violent places, places that I wouldn't go at night. So anyhow, well, only if Leslie were accompanying me, because she knows her way, but anyhow, it is quite a violent region.
Yeah, and thinking about the Black Lives Matter movement in the U.S., the rates of homicide against Black Brazilians, it's obscene. Per year, the number of young Black males who are killed at the hands of police, it is truly appalling. So with that, I'll mute.
Leslie, I was actually precisely thinking about the Black Lives Matter movement when I asked the question, because, you know, policing violence is another form of violence with global metrics that are disturbing. And I will say this about my beloved Greece. I think that is a country which is so sensitized to the dangers of excess police power. There is an enormous protest in the country right now because the government has proposed the National University in Athens having a university police force, which is unthinkable to the population. I mean, imagine a debate in this country about whether we should have the Georgia State Police, So there are countries where there are these democratic sensibilities that really identify policing violence as every bit as significant as other kinds. And I assumed he was talking about warfare. I just wanted to raise the point that elides all these other forms of violence that are really a global problem. I just wanted to sort of identify that.
Well, I just saw that. Oh, sorry, Charles, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Leslie.
I was just, again, reading The Economist, and I saw an article about how Bolsonaro, I think it was a couple editions past, has called for all Brazilians to have guns. That's shortening it all, but there's this, I don't know what the current debates are and discussions of that proposal are in Brazil. It would be interesting if anyone who's here right now in the audience has some reflections on that. But anyway, just a point.
Well, I'm sure that will make things safer in Brazil, just as it has in the U.S. But anyway, said with some sarcasm. Yeah, to get back to the refugee issue, I wanted to mention, I'm no expert on refugees or immigration policy, but one thing that's been striking to me about what's happened in Europe recently, since the waves of migrants from North Africa and Syria and Afghanistan, my basic sensibility is that we should be extremely welcoming, and I was very impressed when Angela Merkel opened Germany up to more than 1 million refugees, as she did. But it's also kind of an object lesson, I think, in the dangers of that, because it gave that opening up to refugees in Germany gave the far right in Germany, and in particular the Alternative for Deutschland, a very strong boost. And the refugee crisis has been used by Viktor Orban in Hungary. It's been used by the Five Star Movement and the League in Italy. It's been used by the Front National in France to boost their support. And obviously Trumpism has used immigration in the US to boost its support. So I think that it's caused me, and I don't have an answer here, because I think allowing refugees in is the moral and ethical thing to do. But it's very clear that it produces a very powerful backlash on the right, at least when it happens in large numbers, and that can be destabilizing to the political system. And so I think it's necessary to consider and think about how to offset that effect. And it makes me wonder now whether Angela Merkel, whether she really did or not make the right decision, given kind of what's come out of it. I don't really have a clear answer, but.
Charles, can I just add Greece's party, the Golden Dawn, to that? A neo-fascist party really prompted by the austerity measures imposed by the EU and refugee crisis. And the happy news there is most of the leadership of the Golden Dawn went to jail in October. So it actually, there was a pretty interesting grassroots resistance to that decade-long, whatever one wishes to call it. But Greece, just put Greece in there too, with a sort of interesting response as of this year.
It's interesting to see the relationship between France and Islam, especially, I think, because you have sort of two extremes here. France, even more than the United States, of course, is known for its complete adherence to secularism and what they consider to be the vanguard of Western values and so on. And there's an incredible crisis going on in France right now. And you actually have Macron moving to the right of Le Pen and the Front National, because you see the population sort of shifting against what they perceive as this elitist embrace of refugees. And it's a real tragedy going on within the French Republic right now. And you see happening, this famous novelist and real curmudgeon, Welbeck, who actually wrote a book called Submission, where he predicted exactly this happening within the French political system, that you'd have this right-wing party emerge. And you see these real fractures happening within these societies. And this is why I think we need to do exactly what I was saying before. We have to make the argument that more people is a good thing. That if you look at demographics and economics, demographics is destiny. Your national power will come from more people coming into your country. And that reforming your immigration system, creating legal and clear and institutionalized ways to increase opportunities for people to come in, will indeed improve the situation of your nation. I think that argument is made over and over and over again, and it can be so easily proven as well. And I think, particularly here in the United States, there's even less of a hurdle in terms of perceived cultural difference, right? Roman Catholicism is already established within the United States among a very large percentage of the American population. Roman Catholicism is the faith of most people coming up from south of the border. It's not, we are actually fortunate in being positioned in a situation where a lot of the cultural difference is largely an illusion that has been constructed. And that's even the case within Europe, although people have turned Islam and Islamophobia into a boogeyman, and vice versa. Some Muslims have turned secularism into their own boogeyman as well. President of Turkey, for example. So I think just making as clear as possible that demographics is destiny and clarifying. That's why immigration reform is really actually not just something that would be nice, but something that is intrinsic to the success of our national project and to the international project as well.
Yeah, this is all great points. And I see, so Chip has a comment here, but I think, I was trying to draw a question from it. And one of the things that kind of going back to our conversation a moment ago that sort of took a broader view of what violence actually looks like. Because I heard that and I was like, whoa, well, that's one, and I assumed he meant nation states going, to war against each other, because it couldn't have meant any other thing, because by every other metric, that's all. And one of the things that wasn't included in that was like the structural violence, the kind of policies and institutions and who has access to education and healthcare and a lot of the other ways that violence may, ultimately play out. It might not, you don't necessarily have to beat somebody over the head, but you can make it so that they can't, travel down the street to get to the hospital. And ultimately they're, going to die one way or the other. It's kind of a crude example, but it kind of, I think lays that point forth. Now in Chip's comment here, he talks about, that there's this sort of notion of ebbs and flows in democracy. And he brings up what is an interesting point here. He says, that's the economic depression that facilitates the sort of erosion in a sense. And I think that's an important observation. And what I would add to that, maybe as a question, because each of the regions we're talking about here, everyone I think can speak to this point, where economic inequality has just increased exponentially. So as we're having these conversations about the rise of nationalism and populism and the ability to cooperate and these other sorts of things that have happened, and this did come up, I think, in the context of like having a, policy that is for and by and benefits the quote unquote elite versus everyone else. And so I wonder, and I know we're running short on time, so this is a big sort of grenade to throw into the room, but what sort of role do you see inequality having as something that may really ultimately be a very fundamentally compromising thing in our ability to forge these sort of international cooperation and agreement and movement on these, you know, what we all acknowledge are critical issues.
Well, I thank you for bringing that up, because I think marked economic inequality is a type of social polarization. And going back to Ryan's point before, it does prevent, impede some of these bigger efforts. So just to add my 2 cents.
I'm interested. Yeah, this is a great question. I mean, it got me thinking. You know, I teach Latin American politics at the undergraduate level, and turns out before the COVID pandemic, for the first time in a long time, we'd seen about 1.5 decades to 2 decades of declining inequality in Latin America, fueled by the commodity boom, basically. Now that that's over, and you get now you're layering crises on top of that, and that's going to be the pandemic and the current and future economic crisis that's going to follow. You know, I think what you could have this, there was a rising level of expectation. I mean, I remember Leslie and I we participated in something about 10 years ago now about the rising middle class in Latin America. And, you know, there was a rise. And then when you hit the top and you go back down, what does that do to you as a citizen? How do you see, who do you blame for that? And who do you follow politically when they try to tell you who to blame for that? And so I think it's this rising expectations that could be interesting, maybe in other places too.
Well, I think that you get, oh, sorry, Charles. Oh, okay. Well, I think that in Brazil specifically, from 2003 to 2014, approximately, you had really selling the idea of this new middle class and the new Brazil. And then the fall in the commodities market that started around 2011, but really started to be felt around 2014. The myth that had been sold fell apart. And then what do you get? You get... To take a shortcut, you get to Bolsonaro elected and he takes office in 2019. You know, there's the disgruntledness, the feeling that people have been told, they were sold some lies. So,
yeah, I agree. I think inequality is absolutely critical to understanding what's happening in the world right now. You know, because as inequality increases, it makes it more difficult, of course, for those at the bottom to make their way up, and it makes them more open to authoritarian or populist appeals. And at the same time, those who are in the middle are more concerned about losing their status and dropping to the bottom because they know that they'll have a harder time getting back up. And I think part of the phenomenon that we've seen in the developed world has been those, you know, in the middle, and there's definitely a racial component here as well. Those in the middle, you know, fearing a loss of status, and inequality exacerbates that as well. And so I think what's driving it is in part economic forces, because with a increasingly integrated world economy, there's more, you know, people who have particular skills are better able to make a lot of money, and people who don't have those skills have a harder time making any money. And so I think it's partially that, but it's also partially the fact that governments have not had the wherewithal to engage in somebody keeps texting me, to engage in redistributive policies that might offset some of these pressures. You know, in the past, we've had governments that have, you know, when we've had economic sorts of transitions, we've had states working harder to offset those effects than we have now. So it's a combination of an unwillingness on the part of states to offset these pressures, combined with, you know, a new stage in globalization producing inequality, and that generates, I think, particular types of populist sorts of pressures. But there's a lot of research now in political science showing how dangerous inequality is for democracy. It's been a hot topic for a few years now, and I think there's just a lot of evidence that economic inequality is corrosive.
I love the question, and I kind of wanted to think it together with Alan's comment, though, because what strikes me about the sort of global political climate is we have very much a politics of sentiment, and the dominant sentiment seems to be resentment. So there's economic resentment that you've just described, but I think the difference between French secularism and US secularism, like French secularism really is designed to get in the way of religion. And US secularism is supposed to sort of stay out of it. And that has created, and Erdogan's a perfect example of this, has created religious resentment of what's perceived as aggressive secularism. And we're seeing ethnic resentment of the loss of prestige in an ethnic majority. And I guess to me, that's one of the connecting threads between the populism we've been talking about and the ethnic and the religious nationalisms on the rise. There's a resentment in each case that's identifiable and a driving factor, it seems to me.
Yeah, I think in really critically important points, I think one of the things that, in addition to the sort of economic issues of it, I come at this as sort of a social psychologist trained in intergroup relations, and some of the things that really light people's fuse are almost sort of counter their economic interests, because it's, really steeped in like that sort of social and national or whatever the kind of salient group-based identities are. And I think, when you can create a sense of a superordinate goal and identity, like along issues like climate change, which actually was one of the great ways to create that superordinate identity that transcends sort of national pieces, but the thing that really works against that is when some of those sort of identities take, increasing prominence. So it's been a great conversation. I see Ghulam put in a question that I think what we ought to do is note that and build a whole program around about interregional economic alliances, because I think that is where, we can really take this. So thank you, Ghulam. I'm glad that you put that there, and I wish we had a little more time, but unfortunately, we're just about at the very end. So I wanted to take this moment to thank you all, Ryan, Leslie, Lou, Alan, and Charles, for sharing your time and insight with us today, both here, but also, participating throughout in the prep, sort of preparing for this, and then earlier in the day. It's really an awesome discussion. And like I said at the outset, it's really great to get the gang back together here and be able to have this kind of conversation. I forget how much I really, miss that and enjoy when we're able to do that. So we will make a point to follow up. Diana Ren-Rapp and Shebnem Askan are colleagues at the Atlantic Global Studies Center, putting this together. Thank you all for being here. I see Ghulam on the screen now. Thank you for supporting and being part of this and bringing Charles into the conversation. Please do, if you can, we have our final keynote for the Atlanta Global Studies Symposium at 3:30 today. It's our keynote from Sheila Walker, and her talk is on a celebration of the global African diaspora. And in preparing for that, talk about just someone who is fascinating, and I am so looking forward to hearing from her. And so please do join us again. That's at 3:30. We will make the session, today's session is recorded. It'll be on our YouTube channel, and we'll have the links for sharing and however you see fit. So again, we are right at 2:30. Thank you all so much for a great session and for your time and energy. And it was an honor to be here with you today.